Pillow talks Texas. He has been for over 45 years, and there isn't a human on the planet with more experience solving problems on behalf of taxpayers. He wants to solve your problem whether you know you have one or not. So if you do have a current tax problem, call the office or visit TaxHelpOnline.com. If you don't have a current tax problem, your current tax problem is taxes themselves. So let's get into the policy issue of today. And in the news, we have reports that no state has axed its income tax in over 45 years, but now 2 southern states are on a path to do just that. Both Mississippi and Kentucky are on track to remove state income taxes. So the question is, how do these states intend on collecting revenue?
Well, what's happening in Mississippi is they're using primarily sales tax to do it, which is the model that I've advocated for many, many years now. Actually, since 1993, when my book, How to Fire the IRS, was released, I advocated for the abolition of the IRS and the federal income tax and the adoption of a national retail sales tax. Well, the states that have no income taxes right now, and there's about 6 or 7 of them. Tennessee is one of them. Alaska, Texas, Florida. There's a couple of others. South Dakota. These states are using primarily consumption taxes to raise the revenue that they need to operate. Now, what Mississippi is doing is they already have a consumption tax in place, as do most states. So they're abolishing their state income tax, and they're using sales tax revenue primarily as the means for raising the revenue in the state. Now, the Mississippi plan is actually a phase-in, so it's not a situation where they've just wiped the slate clean of the income tax. That's not how it's going to work. But they are absolutely, as you say, on track to abolish their state income tax.
So what does this mean for the businesses in these states?
It turns the states into an enterprise zone. I proposed to the state of Minnesota back in the early part of the 2000s. In fact, there was a letter that I wrote to then Governor Pawlenty, where I actually proposed a state blue ribbon commission to study the state's tax and fiscal policies and to write a report that would be presented to the state legislature, the Minnesota legislature, that would call for radical tax reform. My proposal was based on the study that I wrote for the state of Minnesota back in 1999-2000 called Freedom to Prosper, which did a detailed analysis of the state's economic and income tax system. And I called for the abolition of the state income tax, personal income tax, and corporate income tax in exchange for using consumption taxes as a broad base of collecting the revenue. So what I argued to the state legislature back then is that it would create an enterprise zone. It would take the state of Minnesota and make the entire state an enterprise zone. And what I mean by that is back in the mid to late 90s, the state of Minnesota was going around county by county and giving tax relief to counties that were particularly economically depressed. We saw it in the northern part of the state where the so-called Iron Range communities were suffering economic downturn because so many people were leaving those counties and going to the cities to find jobs. And so the legislature at the time, Democrat controlled, of course, primarily, not controlled necessarily, but Democrat legislatures would say, well, let's create an enterprise zone. Let's give special tax breaks to these counties, to businesses in these counties, to foster economic growth in those counties. And my challenge to the Minnesota legislature back then is, why not make the entire state of Minnesota an enterprise zone? Why don't we abolish corporate income tax? Let's abolish the personal income tax. Let's refine our sales tax system, which is a complete mess. Let's refine it and hone it down to replace the revenue using consumption taxes, and the entire state would draw businesses in from everywhere. What's happening in the state of Minnesota right now, and recent studies have shown that the state of Minnesota is hemorrhaging businesses, and we are hemorrhaging high-income taxpayers. What's happening in the state of Minnesota, because our tax system is so messed up, is that businesses are fleeing. They're going to tax-favorable states like South Dakota, like Texas, like Tennessee. They're fleeing the state, and high-income earners in the state of Minnesota are also fleeing the state. People vote with their feet, Josh. If they don't like the tax policies of the state, if the legislature is creating a situation where high-income people are unwelcome, guess what? They vote with their feet, and that's exactly what they're doing in the state of Minnesota. We are losing tens of billions of dollars in income revenue in this state because people are leaving. So the state of Minnesota has to take a lesson from these states. You mentioned Kentucky and Mississippi. Mississippi has already passed the law. They're not on track to do it, right? They have passed the law, and the governor of that state has signed into law the legislation that will phase their income tax out over time. Kentucky's working on it. Georgia has talked about it. Wisconsin's talked about it. The state of Iowa is talking about it. Some states out there have already done it. And so this is something that has to happen state by state across the country.
One of the biggest criticisms of the removal of the income tax and the implementation of consumption tax is that the biggest criticism is that it is a regressive tax. So how can this actually be good for low income people? How is this anything but a tax cut for the rich, as they say?
Well, that's exactly what they say, and they say it over and over and over again, and it's simply not true. We have three types of tax systems. People only focus on two of them. All right, the tax is either in their mind regressive or progressive, and so their idea of a progressive tax is you tax higher income people, not just more money, but you tax them at a greater rate. You tax lower income people at a lesser rate. Right. So in the context of our federal income tax, we got a 10% income tax bracket, and it marches all the way up to 37%. And so the higher income you earn, the greater, not just more taxes you pay, but the greater percentage of taxes that you pay. That's a progressive system. It hits high income people harder. A regressive system hits lower income people harder, right? Falls heavier on them. But and you don't want a regressive system either. But neither do you want a progressive system, because a progressive system is contrary to sound economics. It's unconstitutional. There's no doubt about that in my mind. And it's immoral. Just because you have more resources than somebody else doesn't mean you have a moral obligation to pay a greater percentage of your income on the taxes. Now, you have a responsibility to pay more taxes. There's no doubt about that, but not necessarily a greater percentage of your income. All right. But the third system is a proportional system. A proportion, this is one that never ever gets discussed. A proportional system is a tax system that falls on all income levels in proportion to their wealth. All right. So lower income people naturally pay less taxes because they have less wealth. All right. Therefore, they spend less money. Higher income people necessarily pay more taxes because they spend more money. They've got greater resources. They spend more of those resources. No question about that. And therefore, they pay more taxes. So it's proportional. It falls on all income levels in proportion to their earnings and their spending. That is the sound system. That is the moral system. It's a constitutional system. And that is the system that has to be adopted. No question in my mind about that.
So I think one of the nitpicks, poor people have less money to spend, but they spend a higher percentage of the money that they have, meaning that more of their money goes to paying taxes.
The suggestion is that more of their money has to be used to spend on essentials than the rich people who don't spend proportionally same amount of money on essentials. But rich people are the ones that buy the boats. Rich people are the ones that buy the mansions. They're the ones that buy the fancy cars. They're the ones that buy the fancy jewelries and furs. They're the ones that buy the plane tickets to Rome. They're the ones that do all of the excessive spending because they have the capacity to do it. And so to say that just because lower income people spend a greater percentage of their income on necessities than higher income people do does not mean that higher income people don't pay more taxes. They most certainly do pay more taxes.
You listed off a few of the states that don't have income taxes. And right now that list is actually Alaska, Florida, Nevada, New Hampshire, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, and Wyoming. They're all currently income tax free versus New York, Hawaii, Vermont, Maine, California, Connecticut, and Minnesota, which have the highest income tax burdens, progressive income tax burdens in the union. Can you compare and contrast these states in terms of economic growth and opportunity right now?
Yeah, that's a darn good question. Here's the reality, right? In states that have an income tax, particularly high tax states, right? Not just an income tax, but high tax states. Those states tend to do much worse economically in times of economic downturn, and they perform less aggressively in times of economic prosperity, right? Whereas states that don't have an income tax, that function on consumption taxes primarily, do much better in times of economic growth, and they don't have as significant a setback in times of economic downturn. So in other words, the states with a consumption tax are far more stable economically than states with an income tax. The income tax hits people hard hits the state hard when economic downturns arise and people are hit as in their pocketbooks. So there's no question that states without an income tax that are functioning on a sales tax are far better, far sounder economic footing than the states with an income tax.
What real ways can we see the effects of these tax policies on the citizens of these states?
Well, the best way to look at it is what's happening in Minnesota over the last 3 or 4 years. Over the last 4 plus or minus 4 years in the state of Minnesota, we've been controlled by a Democrat Senate, Democrat House of Representatives, and a radical leftist Democrat governor. All right, they have managed to squander an $18 billion budget surplus by creating new spending programs. And not only did they spend the $18 billion in budget surplus, but now we are projected to be $6 billion in the hole in this upcoming biennium. So 18 plus 6, that's what, $24 billion the state of Minnesota has managed to squander in the last 4 or 5 years. I mean, completely squander the money. It's one thing to spend the money. It's another thing to create new welfare programs that require that money, that same amount of money, to be spent over and over and over again, year after year. And that's exactly what the state of Minnesota has done. And so, as I alluded to earlier, the fact of the matter is that businesses and high-income taxpayers are leaving the state of Minnesota. They're making a run for it. So that's going to affect the state's capacity to raise revenue to fund these new welfare programs that they have started. You create a downward slide that cannot be reversed. You continue to tax these businesses and these high-income people at a very high level. You create programs to spend the money that you collect through the taxes, which more and more people are unwilling to pay, and so therefore they make a run for it to lower tax states like South Dakota, like Tennessee, like Nevada, like Texas. This list of states that you mentioned, Florida, of course, is high on the list of destination states, right, for people in the north. They're making a run for it, which means that the state then has less capacity to raise revenue to fund these programs that they created. It's a death spiral for these high tax states. They've got to stop doing this.
You mentioned it's a direct correlation. It's a direct line of people leaving the progressive tax states and going to the states without income taxes whatsoever. It's not just a correlation. It is a direct causal line.
Yeah, you can draw a straight line. No question about it. It's not an abstract correlation. There's no question about it. People vote with their feet, no doubt about it.
Thanks for watching, taxpayers, and remember, there's no such thing as a hopeless tax case. If you think yours is the exception, call the office or visit our website to get a hold of Dan here. He will help you see the daylight. Dan, tell them where else they can follow along with your taxpayers' rights crusade.
All right, absolutely. Well, thanks for your time and attention. Follow me at Pilot Talks Taxes. I'm primarily on TikTok, Facebook, True Social, and right here on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe, like, and share these videos, especially with your state and federal representatives. And if you have a tax problem, go to my website, TaxHelpOnline.com, and we will have a solution for you.